All right, let's finish this chapter up. We're on page 402, Programming Custom Validation. As it says, a few types of validation functions are particularly common. First one we've talked about several times, and that is the required field entry. Second, checking values that are dependent on values of other controls. What does that mean? You've all seen this where you've got a password and then a confirm password. All right, so you've got to make sure you type it in correctly twice. Checking for an appropriate content type in one or more fields. Again, if it's a numeric field, making sure there are numbers in it. The plan for the Snoot Flowers order form envisions using red backgrounds and borders along with custom error messages displayed at the top of the page and within each field set containing an error. So you can see what they're planning on doing here. This is all the stuff on page 403. All the fields that need a value that don't have it are shown in red here, and then a message is shown on the bottom. So you go in and you programmatically do the work to do this. So as it says, to implement this design, you'll create validation functions that use all three types of logic just described. All right. So in chapters 1 and 2, you learned about the many types of events you can listen for in JavaScript. One is the submit event. As it says, the submit event fires when a form is submitted. Typically, it's because you've got a submit button on the form, and you click it. All right. So as it says, you'll call all of your custom validation functions from main. So main, again, used as a driver. You've heard this before. All right. So you will put a bunch of code in there on 404, 405, 6, 7, and 8. And I'm not going to lie to you. When I sit there and I'm writing up one of these tests, I go through the book and I look at what you had to do in certain parts, certain assignments, either at the end of the chapter or on the case study, and oh, that's good, so I add that. Now on the bottom of page 408, the author says you use different properties to validate each form element and input type. For text boxes, all right, as it says that display a box allowing character input, you can use the value property. Does everybody hear that? You use the value property to check for a value. I believe that's on the test. I could be wrong, but I think it is. Some of the common methods you use with that are shown on pages 409 and 410. As always, they put it in an alphabetized list. Some of these we've talked about already. Notice that for checkboxes and radio buttons, you use the checked property. I'd say that would be a good one to know for the test. All right. Source sets returns the URL of an image. We'll get into that in just a bit because you know that source is used for other things as well. Some of the commonly used input elements and their associated form controls. Remember, you've heard me say this shtick before. If I've got a form, make it a simple form. This will ask for the first name and the last name. So if I'm in here and I click or I type in Jeff, and then I take my mouse and I click in here, 2 events fire. A blur event going from one form to another, and a focus event because I'm on a new one. So right there they talk about blur and they talk about focus. You should have an idea for your test what both of those do. All right. I mean, I suppose if I wanted to be that big a doofus, I could literally write a test that would ask you to check all this stuff, and you never get it done in 4 hours. But I'm going to use the ones that are typically discussed more in here. Those are the ones you're going to use the most often. The author even gives you a for instance here. For instance, to check if the input element is blank, you could use this. You already know now what this means, the document.getElementById. And if I say .value, that's what's in it. And if it equals double quote, rather, all right, that I could put a message here that said something along the lines of, an alert box that says you can't leave the first name blank, that kind of thing. And you will do some of that on pages 411, 412, 413, and 414. Checking for selection lists with no values, we already talked about this. That's like the state that doesn't have anything in there. Please remember, for a list like this, that if it's empty, then it's -1. Not 0, -1, because it's 0 based. So if it's 0, the first element in the drop-down has been chosen. If it's -1, no elements have been chosen. All right? And again, you will put some code in there to do that on 415, 416, and 417. In much the same way, checking for option button sets with no selection. Does everybody understand this? That if I've got, let's just say here, that I've got, it says gender. All right, and we've got male with a radio button and female with a radio button. If I leave it like that, it's possible for the person to leave it blank, correct? But if I default it, let's say I know I've got more males, so that is blackened. Now, it's impossible not to select one of them. Does that make sense? So quite often when you use radio buttons like this, you will make one, all right, you will take one of them and you will make it basically, you will have it selected on purpose. On the other hand, if I've got check boxes, so let's say that I have got, the old way that you used to do this, bold, underline, italicize, let's say, with these, italicize. And I've got 3 check boxes. I might want 0, 1, 2, or all 3 of them checked. So normally with check boxes, you don't set them ahead of time. But with radio buttons, you should take the most obvious option if there is one. Now, if at this school, you probably noticed it, 95, 98% of the people who go here are male. So it would make sense for gender to set it to male. All right, if it was a university and it was 50-50, then you just set it to whatever one you want. So again, you'll put code in there on 418, 419, 420, and 421. On 421, the author talks about, on the bottom of the page, validating dependent fields with custom functions. Says the custom functions you've created so far follow general patterns, but sometimes you might have something, it's not at all inconceivable that if you're hired to do some work for somebody, they may give you some really weird requirements. All right. Now they talk about, starting on the bottom of the page here, validating based on the state of a checkbox. Well, that should make sense. If you've got, remember earlier, they had all of those different holidays up at the top. Congratulations, birthday, wedding, anniversary, etc. Those were all done as checkboxes, all right? Because you want to make sure that the message that you put in by default is like, it goes with the occasion. Does anybody know, this is no joke, that 2 of the words that are most mixed up in the English language are wedding and funeral? 2 of the words that people most mix up in the world, literally. Somebody talks about, oh, you're getting married? Yeah, I'm going to a funeral. Yeah, they do that. It sounds weird, but the reason I'm telling you that is you want to make sure, I want to go back to the beginning of the chapter. This, when I tell it to you, you're going to be like, duh, but I just want to make sure you get this. So way at the beginning of the chapter, we looked at this, and it was on page 368. So I got to jump here and then jump back. And again, this is not meant to be funny. I don't think it is funny. Okay? They don't have it there, but what if I had something like sympathy? There's not one there, but you know, wouldn't that make sense? Someone died. You would want to make sure that with sympathy, if I'm going to have a message pop in here based on this, you know, some kind of a message for sympathy, I don't want there to be a congratulatory message in there. And again, I know that sounds simple, but it's the kind of thing that if you didn't put that in, and you know somehow that got sent to somebody, all right, you could get yourself into trouble. And I don't mean legal trouble, but you know, people would write a letter to their paper or whatever. So you do that on 422, 423, and 424. And the author has here validating based on text box content. All right. How much validation you do depends on what it is you're asking for. Okay. Typically, a first name should have only letters in it. That makes sense? But you look at a last name, letters, hyphens, maybe an apostrophe, and some people after the apostrophe they have a blank space. That's a lot of stuff they have to look for. So they have you do that on 425, 426, and 427. And going on to 428, I guess. All right. The final type of validation that you do in here is probably the hardest because it's credit card validation. All right. And maybe you've noticed that a lot of places, you know, there are places that I do business with electronically. They don't even like it anymore when I want to enter my credit card information. They want me to use PayPal. Why do you think they want everybody to use PayPal instead of being able to put in credit card information? Anybody know? If I do PayPal, that's only one thing I have to code for. But if I do credit cards, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, etc., all right, I might have up to a dozen or more different types of credit cards. But if I require everybody to use PayPal, it's less code that I have to write. So the last thing that you do in here on 429, 430, 431, and going on to 432 is the validation for credit cards. All right? Guess that didn't take as long as I thought it would. I remember reading this and then going back and rereading it and just thinking, man, this is a long chapter, but 2/3 of the chapter is code and them giving you explanations of the code that you're writing. All right, so you should know what validation is. You should know that the selected index property, if it's set to -1, means nothing has been selected. You should know what a placeholder attribute is. You should know that for a checkbox, it's the checked attribute. This is one we didn't talk about, and I think it's on the test. All right? And it's called prevent default. Right? What I can do, so if I've got a form and it's got a submit button on it, okay? So let's say it's got a submit button on it and the code that was written to validate the form just really stinks. That even if there's errors in it, boom, it goes out to the server anyway, even though it shouldn't do that. You with me? What I can do then is I can say if there's been any errors, I can do this. I can do a prevent default, which means instead of you going out to a new website and doing that ahref, it says prevent that action from happening. So if I click on a link with prevent default, I don't leave the page I'm on. All right? These key terms I already mentioned, you should know assistive functions. You should know constraint validation API. Although we didn't talk about it, I remember friction is in there. Friction, a loose measure of the persistence required for a website user to accomplish a goal. All right. Should know what submit event is, and we already talked about validation. So let's look at these questions that are at the end of the chapter, starting on the bottom of page 434. As always, it works better if you answer them, or at least attempt to. Review question 1, bottom of page 434. Objects representing each of the controls in a form are stored in what collection? Number 1. It's right in the question. It's in the forms collection. So number 1 is A, forms. Number 2, which of the following type values for an input does not enable you to provide a limited set of choices? I looked at that and thought it was email. All right. Number 3, we just talked about this. What value of selected index, somebody tell me, means nothing has been selected? Which one of these for 3? -1. So number 3 is A. Number 4, to simulate the behavior of placeholder text in older browsers, you can set the value of, it's the value property, D. 5 and 6, you should get these. Which event do you use to call a function when you move to a field? All right, when you move into a field, that field is getting the, what? No, just the opposite. It's getting the focus. When you leave for 6, that's blur. So when you come into a field, you're giving it the focus. When you're leaving a field, you get a blur. It's typically you have to physically move. It depends on how it's set up. If you can literally move something via the mouse move, then it could be, but usually it's a click. All right, number 7. Which of the following indicates whether a checkbox or option button is selected? All right, checked. 7 is A. Number 8. What do you assign to the value property to remove its content? So how do you remove anything from that? You've done this before. What is number 8? C, the empty string. Number 9, which of the following attributes triggers browser-based validation in modern browsers? All right. Well, to trigger browser-based validation, I think it's D, because source equals is what you're going to be, that's going to say that it's calling a JavaScript program. All right. Could be wrong, but I think that's the right one. Number 10, which of the following input types triggers browser-based validation? So which of these is automatically going to make the browser do something? What? I thought it was D, number, because that'll make sure that you don't put anything non-numeric in. Right? Number 11, which of the following properties is true if you left a required field blank? And the answer is B. There's a value missing property. Number 12, which of the following attributes would you use to say that the form must have a value in that field before it can be submitted? You already know this. C, required. Number 13, what method do you use to disable? I just mentioned this to you. It's the prevent default. So 13 is A. 14, I actually don't think any of these are right because there's something that's called scroll top. If that question is on the test and I don't think it is, it's now thrown out. 15, you already know this one. Haven't we used this? Is NaN? That's how you force numeric input. Number 16, how to transfer the contents of one field to another field. Well, that's what we did with the Build to and the deliver to address. We already looked at that. Number 17, the purpose of no validate is if the person has turned JavaScript off on their browser. Number 18, explain how the validity object is used. We didn't go through the validity object, but there's a bunch of stuff that you can check for validity state. If you look here, this is from developer.mozilla.org. You can do things like type mismatch, field too long, field too short, etc. Number 19, explain how to check if an option button is selected. It's the checked. We already talked about that. And number 20, we just talked about that, is NAN. All right, now, I'm going to do one more thing, and then the rest of the period is yours. And that is, if you go out to your mail, and you look out on your mail from last week, I sent you a Chapter 6 study guide. All right. So I'll give you a minute or two to open that up. It should look like this. I don't tape this, so I'm going to turn this part off.